Hey there. Welcome to another installment on books and stories on mythology. I'm sorry if I look like I'm looking in the wrong direction. I'm using my iPad instead of my iPhone to make this video because my phone keeps dying on me, and I think I need a new phone. It's 4 years old. Anyway, today I want to talk about dwarves. Dwarves play a very interesting role in world mythology and folklore, but it's usually in the Norse myths, especially the stories in the Eddas. I talk about the Eddas in my video on Norse books on Norse mythology. The Eddas have quite a few stories, very interesting stories of dwarfs. Dwarfs are sometimes seen as a type of elf or fairy. Sometimes these terms, elf and fairy, get a little, they overlap, and sometimes dwarfs are seen as a type of fairy. But they're a specific type. They're basically beings, and they're about the size of dwarfs. They live they live in the earth. They're very much tied to the earth. What happens is that in the creation myth about dwarves is what happens is that when when the gods killed the primordial giant Ymir and created the universe out of him, what happens is that they noticed that there were maggots eating the dead flesh of Ymir, and the gods gave them some shape, and they became the first dwarves. So the dwarves originally came about as maggots, so they're very much associated with the earth. They sprang spontaneously from the earth. Usually they're not seen in the best light. They're seen as being rather treacherous and rather lecherous. But one good thing about dwarves is that because they're so tied to the earth, they're masters of the elements of the earth. They know all the secrets of jewelry craft. They know how to work with gold and silver and metals and all kinds of things like that, precious jewels, and and not only that, but anything made by a dwarf is amazing. It's got magical powers, just like they are. They're not really human. They're magical beings, just like gods and giants and other beings. I believe they're only male, and they turn to stone in the sunlight, so they got to stay out of the sunlight. There's various stories about dwarves. For example, dwarves are a group of dwarves were involved in the creation of the poetic meads. The mead, the alcoholic drink that Odin gives to people to give them the gift of poetry. Sometimes it's called the skaldic mead, skaldic being a type of poetry. What happens is that they did this by murdering a very wise person named Kvasir, and they took his blood and they mixed it with honey and certain fruit, and they turned it into meat. And then Odin stole it and flew to Asgard with it, and now he has the power to bestow poetry on people because he's got the gift of meat. Dwarfs also made Brisingamen, which is an amazing necklace that is owned by the goddess Freya. Goddess Freya is associated with sexuality and love, and she happened to notice this necklace that the dwarfs made, and she wanted it, and four dwarfs made it. They were four of them, and they said, "Well, you could have it, but you're going to have to sleep with us." And she's thinking, do I sleep with four little twisted dwarves, or do I just say forget it? No, I'll sleep with them. So she slept with them and got the necklace. Well, she is the god of sexuality, so what do you expect? But one really great story is the story of Brock and his brother. What happens is that this is a story of how Sif, the wife of Thor, lost her hair. What happens is Thor had a beautiful wife, and her name was Sif, and she had long golden hair. And one day, as a joke, Loki, the trickster god, the god of mischief, decided to play a joke, and he cut off her hair. But not only did he cut it off, he pulled them out at the roots, so she couldn't grow hair back. So Thor said to Loki, "You better fix this, or you're dead." So Loki said, "Well, I know. If anybody could actually take pure gold, spit it into hair, that it actually can attach to the scalp and look just like regular golden hair, it's the dwarves. So I'm going to go down to the underworld where the dwarves live. Not deep in the underworld where the dead live, Niflheim, but into the earth, into the mountains, into the caves where where the dwarfs live, deep in the earth. And he comes across this group of dwarfs called the Sons of Ivaldi. And they said, "Oh, we'll make Sif's hair, but we'll make two other gifts as well for you." Meanwhile, enter this other dwarf named Brock. Now, Brock says, "My brother is me and my brother and I are better craftsmith than these people. So give us a chance, and we're going to make three gifts that are better than those." So Loki didn't believe them and said, "I'll bet my head you can't." So they said, "Okay." So as they're making the first gift, Brock is working the bellows and his brother's doing the crafting. And because Loki didn't want to lose his head, he turned into this big fly and that stings. And he started stinging Brock's hand. But Brock kept pumping the bellows and the gift was crafted beautifully. The second gift, Loki stung him in the neck, but still Brock didn't stop pumping the bellows and the second gift was made. The third gift that they were making, Loki said, "Well, I don't want to lose my head." So he stings, I keep saying stabs, he stings Brock on the eyelid, and blood comes blinding him in his eye. And Brock had no choice but to, for a split second, stop pumping the bellows and wipe the blood from his eye. And it turns out that this last gift was a hammer. And because he stopped the bellows for a moment, the handle of the hammer was a little too short. So Brock thought, "Oh, we lost the bet." But what they did was they brought all 6 gifts up to the gods to have them decide who made the best gifts. Now, these gifts were amazing. They included a ship that was huge, but it was able to be folded up and put in your pocket. A spear called Gungnir that never missed its mark. An arm ring called Draupnir that produced more of its own kind on its own. And some of these gifts were made by the first set of dwarves, and some of these gifts were made by Brock and his brother. But when it came time to Brock and his brother to present the last gift, the hammer with the shortest handle, even though the handle was short, the gods thought, "Oh my God, this gift is amazing." They gave it to Thor, and Thor realized that not only is it virtually indestructible, it can kill anything, and not only that, when you throw it, it comes back to you. So the gods and Thor thought this was the greatest gift of all, because finally the gods will be safe from their enemies, their perennial enemies, the frost giants. So this is how Thor got his hammer, and this is how Brock and his brother won the bet. They thought that was the greatest gift. So Loki was about to lose his head, but he had to get out of this by saying, "Well, being the tricksy person that he is, he says, 'Well, I did say you could have my head, but I didn't say anything about you could have my neck, any part of my neck.'" So Odin said, "Well, he's got a point. You can't take his head without taking part of his neck." So Loki managed to get away without losing his head, but Brock got a little even by grabbing him and stitching his mouth shut with needle and thread, and to shut Loki up for once. So that's the story. Now moving on to Celtic mythology. The Celts speak more fairies than dwarves. But some of their fairies are called solitary fairies. They sometimes break their fairies into different types, and one group is called solitary fairies because they're found by themselves. And some of these fairies are actually very dwarf-like. For example, the most famous is the leprechaun, of course. I got a leprechaun right here. See? I got this in Ireland. And what happens is that the leprechaun actually is a shoemaker. He sits there and he taps out shoes. There's another fairy called the Chlorochaun, which actually is a fairy that's found in people's basements getting drunk on their booze. And a third type is called the Fear Doric, which is a type of fairy that is a trickster that goes out and plays practical jokes on people. Some argue that this is actually all one fairy. There's when he's working, he's called a leprechaun. When he gets tired and wants to drink, he's a Chlorochaun. And when he gets drunk and wants to start acting out, he's called a Feodoric. But there's many stories of fairy. I mean, it's funny because in Ireland, fairies are also called the good people and the little people as well. So they are kind of small and dwarf-like. And I want to mention I want to mention a couple of other things, a couple of other beings or dwarf-like beings. There's, for example, you sometimes hear of the term troll. Troll is usually pictured as a big, ugly, giant kind of creature from Scandinavia. That's true. But depending on where you go in Scandinavia, they can actually vary in size. Some could be huge, some could be human size, and some could be small. They could be dwarf size as well. So it's not always the case that they're giants. And like dwarves, they come out at night only because they turn to stone in sunlight. There's according to one writer, the term troll is very ancient, and nobody really knows where it came from, and it believes the term has something to do with revolution, revolving. And there's an interesting movie called Troll Hunter. I think you should see it. It uses the motif of real trolls turning to stone in sunlight. It's a blast. And I want to mention another creature. You see this guy in gardens. He's called the gnome, and he's this little dwarf that has this big hat that's as big as him. And the interesting thing about gnomes is that I don't know where it first appeared, but I know that a person who spoke about gnome is actually, rather than a folklorist, he was an occultist, an alchemist by the name of Paracelsus. Now, he was a real doctor that lived in, I think, Switzerland, and he was a very interesting character. He wrote about early medicine and alchemy and magic, and he believed that the elements that the elements that the Greeks talked about had different beings living inside of them. In rock, in the earth, they're the gnomes, and they could move through rock like humans move through air. Air contains beings called sylphs. Water contains beings called undines, and finally, fire contains figures called salamanders. But the rocks and the earth contain gnomes. Another interesting thing about gnomes is that their cap is very similar to what many dwarves wear in mythology and folklore, and sometimes it's referred to as the tarn cap, and it's what allows dwarves to become invisible. Dwarfs and dwarf-like fairies actually play a big role in folklore in terms of being little diminutive beings that help people in the house and the stable and the yard and all kinds of things. They stay out of sight. You don't see them, but if you find that the clothes are washed and the dishes are done, it's done by a type of fairy that's a house spirit. There's various names for these. One name I've come across is Brownie. A Brownie is a type of house spirit, a little fairy dwarf-like being that lives quietly out of the way in houses. And usually these beings they want a small reward for what they do. They don't ask for much, but if you don't give it to them, they could get really angry, and they might burn your house down if you make them angry enough. I think that's all I'm going to say. I mean, basically, there's a lot more to be said about dwarves, but I don't want to make this video too long. I'll just share with you a few books that I first learned about dwarves. This book is really wonderful. It's a Time Life book. It's from a series called The Enchanted World, and it's called Dwarves. And I don't know if it's still available. You could contact Time Life Books and see if you could find it. It has all these wonderful stories of dwarves, not only from Norse mythology, but from other areas as well. Here's Brock, the dwarf being bitten by Loki as a fly on his eyelids. There's also this really great book. I learned a little bit about Celtic fairies from this book here. It's called, well, actually, this is two books in one. It's actually the first book here that's pictured. It's called Fairy and Folktales of the Irish Peasantry. The second book is Cuchulainn, but don't worry about that. That's another book. But the book I'm talking about is Fairy and Folktales of the Irish Peasantry, and it's collected by Yeats, the poet Yeats. He was very interested in Ireland folklore and mythology, and he collected these stories. And it's also in this book that I learned about the origins of gnomes and Paracelsus as well. The other story, I learned about trolls and other magical beings from this book here, which is different from Norse mythology. Norse mythology, usually people talk about the Eddas and a few other sources, but in folklore, there's other books you could refer to, and that's Scandinavian Folktales, simple title, translated and edited by Jacqueline Simpson. So so I learned about various magical beings in here, including trolls and everything. Okay, until next time.